So my name is Adam Watson. I am an agriculture agent here in Washington County with UT Extension. Tonight we're going to be talking about pruning berries. And so we'll be talking about blackberry, raspberries, and blueberries. Understand as we go through tonight, if I'm mentioning any sort of commercial products or brand names, there's no implied endorsement from myself or the university. The other thing to remember is nothing I say here trumps a pesticide label. You may have heard the phrase before that the pesticide label is the law. And so any instructions that are on the pesticide label have to be followed, and nothing that I say different counts for anything. So my words do not supersede that pesticide label instructions. So as I said, we are going to be looking at caneberries or our blackberries and raspberries first. Then we will be looking at blueberries. And so we'll be able to talk through those, and I hope you find it interesting. So caneberries, sometimes we call those brambles. You'll kind of see that used interchangeably. And basically, if you're used to pruning fruit trees, or if you're at last week's fruit tree pruning class, you're going to see a lot of differences, and not surprising. They're a very different plant, but we do have basically more pruning activity than we do with like our woody fruit trees in a way. And so we'll talk about that, but basically we're going to look at when we would be pruning at planting, the first year during the summer and subsequent years, and then during the dormant season. And so you're going to see those key times pointed out with both raspberries and blackberries. Keep in mind that these berries are biennial growth habit, meaning it takes 2 years for them to complete their reproductive cycle or to fruit. And so with floricane varieties, the first year we actually don't have fruit produced. What is grown is a vegetative bramble, and that is a primocane. It does not produce fruit buds that year. It just grows vegetatively, so no harvest. But in year 2, that cane now actually fruits for us. So it takes 2 seasons for us to actually get a crop off of that. So in year 1, it's called a primocane. In year 2, it's called a floricane. We do have categories of primocane fruiting brambles. The key to understand about these is sometimes they're not called that when we find them in catalogs or for sale. Sometimes they'll be called fall bearing. Sometimes they'll be called ever bearing. The key thing about them is they do produce a fruit crop on that first year cane. So primocane fruiting means that that first year's growth will produce fruit, and it's late in the season, the first year. They will subsequently have a second crop on that same cane in year 2, just as we would expect a floricane to produce. So primocane fruiting will fruit on both primocane and floricane growth. We have different growth habits when it comes to our berries. And so they can be very erect, so they're upright. We can have semi-erect, and then we can have trailing. And so how we would approach growing these is a little bit different, because essentially we're using a little bit different trellis systems for each one. That being understood, it basically isn't all that different how we approach them with annual pruning. I will say the one thing that we might see when we see a newly planted bramble is that the first season growth is often more trailing. So even in an erect variety, we might see that it's not quite as upright of growth as we would expect. Don't let that throw you. Don't let that concern you that, oh, did I get what I actually meant to purchase? Just consider that that first year growth often is not quite as erect as we would expect. Trellising is very highly encouraged. So it is less critical for black raspberries or the very erect varieties of blackberries, but I still think there's value in it. There's any number of forms a trellis can take. And depending on how many berries you're planting, you may do more or less elaborate systems. Sometimes just planting them, up against a fence row might be all you require. But what happens for a lot of producers, and these are from commercial examples, but it's either a double T trellis or is what it's commonly called. So you see the wood version there kind of in the center of the screen, where you have a post at the end and posts throughout the length of the row. Then you have one horizontal crossbar at the top and one horizontal crossbar lower down. And each one of those has a wire on each side. So it kind of corrals those brambles in. Those work really well, especially for the more upright varieties, because it allows the fruit to be up higher. It's easier to pick. It's easier if you're going to do any spraying, which we don't do a tremendous amount of spraying with berries in our area, but certainly this makes it easier. And if you need more information about trellising, you're welcome to reach out to me. These pictures actually came primarily from the Southeast Regional Caneberry Production Guide. It's a commercial publication, but that typical V shape works very well, both in the home planting as well as commercial. So at planting, when we're planting these dormant brambles, we want to cut them back. They're already just a stick with some roots. We want to cut them back a little more, because what we're wanting to do is force bud break to come from those crown buds. So we want to cut them back pretty severely when we plant them. We don't gain anything by leaving that cane intact that we have there. So we're much better off basically to get the plant to start over in a sense, so that we start reestablishing good positive growth. You might have inherited berries. So if you bought property and there are already berries there, you might be wondering, well, are they blackberries? Are they raspberries? Because there are black raspberries, for instance. It's actually easy to tell blackberry and raspberry from each other. With raspberries, when you harvest the fruit, you leave something behind on the plant. So the fruit that you actually pull off, that you harvest, is kind of like a thimble. There's a hollow space in the middle. So you can see it there on the left with a red raspberry, or in the center picture, a black raspberry. And what's left behind is the receptacle. It's not an integral part of the berry that we harvest. So if you're hollowing out berries and they kind of look like a thimble, they have that hollow area, you're most likely dealing with a raspberry. Blackberries on the underside do not have that. Their receptacle is an integral part of the berry. So when we harvest it, there's nothing left behind on that plant. There's no receptacle left behind, because it's actually in the berry itself. So it's very evident when you have them side by side. And it's not difficult to tell from a picture. If you're harvesting berries, you can tell quickly. Now, if we're talking about something like loganberries or some of the others that are different sorts of hybrid berries, don't ask me. I'm not for sure what they're going to look like. But certainly comparing blackberry to raspberry is very straightforward. So we have planted our brambles and we have growth happening. So there on the left-hand side, we've got that straight upright growth of a prima cane started, and it's going great. So what we want to do for our flora cane varieties, these are the ones that fruit in the second year. If we're dealing with semi-erect or erect blackberries, we are going to go in and tip those newly grown canes. The height we tip them out is partially based on our trellis height, but typically it's anywhere from 36 to 60 inches high. You will be, if you have a number of these plants, you're not going to be tipping them all at the same time, because not every cane is going to reach that stage of growth at exactly the same time. And it is important that you go in there and tip them as you see in the picture there. Probably does make sense to wear a leather glove or other gardening gloves, but we want to be able just to break that when it's young, when it's supple, when it's easily broke. We don't want to wait till it starts to become more woody and we have to actually use pruners on it, because this can be a very easy entry port for diseases. And in fact, we'll mention that a little bit in a moment. So again, this is not where we just pick one Saturday, we go through and it's all done. You're going to do this a couple of times through the growing season, because not every single primo cane is going to pop out at exactly the same moment or grow at exactly the same rate. We do this because what we want to have happen is we want the lateral branches to grow, or the side branches. So what we're doing is, it's the same thing we do when we do a heading back cut in a fruit tree. We're removing that terminal bud. That interrupts the flow of the plant hormone auxin, and that allows those side branches to grow more vigorously. So it's exactly the same thing we do when we head back trees, whenever we pinch out herbs or anything else, or mums, to get more bushy growth. It's literally the exact same practice, just here we're doing it on brambles. We want more laterals because that's where we get flowering and fruit set. What about trailing blackberry varieties? You've got a couple of options. And so one is, as they start to have the growth reach the top wire, you can kind of weave them up and down among the trellis wires, depending on how many you have. Or some will wait until the dormant season and actually pull them up, lift them up off the ground, and tie them into a fan pattern and do some pruning. The important thing to understand is that the primary pruning we do with these is during the dormant season. So we're not actually tipping these like we do the semi-erect and erect, but we would do pruning during the dormant season. So a little bit different, but still we're doing with flora cane varieties. So that first year cane, it's just vegetative. It's that second year that we get flowers and fruit set. What about our raspberry flora cane varieties? So with black raspberries, we are going to top those in the same exact fashion that we talked about with the blackberry erect and semi-erect. We're going to actually be topping them shorter because they're not as robust of a plant. So we might be topping them at 24 to 30 inches in height. And so that also tells you that if you're having a trellis for black raspberries, for instance, it's not going to be as tall as you would for blackberries. So consider that when you make your trellis, how adaptable it is if you're going to have different varieties of berries growing. Purple raspberries should be topped about 30 to 36 inches in height. They're a little more vigorous. The red and yellow fruited raspberries should not be topped. So we do have some differences among the different types of raspberries. And so act accordingly. And again, same idea. We want to go in there when those tips are still young and supple, easy to snap and break. We'd rather it not be woody. We want to very specifically avoid the tipping either immediately before. So if we have rain predicted, if it is actually raining, or just following a rain or an overhead irrigation. The reason is we're creating that open wound. And if we allow that to be wet for extended periods of time, because when we're timing this, we're much more likely to see cane blight infections. So we want that to heal quickly. We don't want it to remain wet. And so do look at the forecast before you do this. So it would be better to wait a day or two as opposed to have them rained on soon after you do this tipping. What about in following summers? Basically, with our primocane, we do exactly what we just talked about, that first year's growth. Primocanes are always going to be tipped as appropriate. Again, some raspberries we don't. Each summer, because each year we're wanting to encourage those laterals to grow so we get more flowering and more fruiting. When we have flora canes after the first summer, because that first summer we don't have fruiting canes yet, we just have the new growth. But in year two, we're going to have flora canes present. We can remove those flora canes, those that have fruited, as soon as they're done with fruit. So as soon as they have fruited, we've harvested them, they don't have any more coming on, we can go ahead and remove it. We don't have to wait to the dormant season to do that. So we can in summer, we'll continue to do the tipping as appropriate. And then also, as the harvest is finished, we can remove those fruited canes on our flora cane fruiting varieties. What about dormant? So we've gone through the first summer, we tipped them. So what we have on the left are those canes that we limited their height and we encourage the lateral growth. And you can see there, we have a good bit of lateral growth. Well, we actually want to control that some because we have more than we want. So if we have not removed those fruited canes in the instances of we're past year two, go ahead and do that. So we can always remove those in dormant if we haven't done it previously. For blackberries, we're going to prune those laterals back from anywhere from 12 to 18 inches in length. So we are going to shorten what growth we have there. If we have laterals closer to the ground, so let's say within 18 inches of the ground, we're going to remove those completely. Things close to the ground, as the fruit starts to form, is probably going to bend down, get into the grass, get onto the ground, and you're not going to have good berry production from it anyway. So we'll just go ahead and remove those lowest growing laterals. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to thin out the number of canes per foot row. So we would like 4 to 6 canes for each 12 inches of row. And so what you would do is you would choose those that appear to be the weakest, the smallest, the ones with the least lateral growth. And what we're doing is we're opening that plant up so there's better sunlight penetration, so there's better air movement, which again is going to help us limit disease, because leaf wetness, the same as we see with tree fruits, encourages disease. It also means we're going to have less of a mess to go pick through. The more laterals and the longer that are allowed to remain and the more plants we have crammed in the same space, it becomes more difficult for harvest. So what's good about this is we're actually going to get bigger fruit by reducing the number of fruit that are there, because the resources are the same. And so by limiting how much fruit is actually there, we'll encourage larger sizes. With raspberries, same exact thing. We'll remove dead floral canes if not already done. We're going to head back or limit the size of our lateral branches, but it's going to be shorter. If you remember, the height on these was shorter than we left on the blackberries. Likewise, we're going to have shorter lateral branches. So 8 to 10 inches in length. And again, we're going to be removing those weak canes. We're going to be thinning to 4 to 6 per plant or per clump. Raspberries don't necessarily, the black and purple don't necessarily spread as much as blackberries do. So you'll see more clumping with them. But again, the same idea, we're limiting the number of plants and thus the amount of fruit that is actually happening in that area. And again, this is during the dormant season. So we don't yet have the new primocanes out of the ground yet. So what's going to happen, let's say this is this time of year, we go in, we prune, we do this. A few weeks from now, we're going to start having those new primocanes, which will fruit the next year, start popping up out of the ground. So that's another reason why we thin the canes in the row. We have more coming. And so we need to, again, reduce the overall number so we have good growth for what is there. When we look at red and yellow raspberries, again, remove the dead floricanes if not already done. We're going to pay attention to winter injury on these too, because these are more likely to have winter injury than the black and purple. So what we'll do is if you have winter injury, you're basically going to have dead areas on typically the tips of those brambles. So you'll actually cut those off, cut it back to live, healthy tissue. So look at that as you go through here. You're also going to be removing weak canes. You're going to thin the canes to about 1 to foot hedgerow. So these are not going to be clump forming. These are going to spread more. And you want about 6 inches in between canes. So again, you're going to limit the width of the row, and then you're going to limit the number of canes that are there, about 6 inches in between. Probably I'd encourage you to look at thinning first and then go back and trimming those tips, because there's no use tip pruning something that you're going to cut out anyway. So again, a little bit different, but still the same basic ideal. We're reducing the number of plants there, and we're removing, in this specific case, winter injury that could be occurring. So let's shift gears and talk about primocane fruiting berries. So again, primocane berries are those that will be fruiting in year 1 on that primocane. It doesn't take year 2 to get a crop. We can manage these one of 2 ways, and I would not say one is better than the other, but the first way is to manage them for a fall crop only. So that first primocane fruiting crop is all we worry about. And then the second method is to allow the crop to happen on the primocane And then we get a second harvest once that primocane matures to the floricane. So 2 crops, a fall crop and then the subsequent summer. This is how we get the terminology summer fruiting or ever bearing on these, is that we're getting more harvest out of them. So what are we looking at with these? In the scenario, and we do have both black berries as well as raspberries that are primocane fruiting. So we can't have both, but we're going to treat them the same regardless of which one it is. So what we would do in this case, we have them growing in the summer. We're going to tip them again about 3 feet tall. They're going to grow. And we will be looking at thinning out if we have some really weak ones, for instance, and because we don't want that row width to get too much. So we do a little bit of thinning in summer. We're going to allow those to grow. They're going to fruit at the end of summer, basically. I have seen some of these fruit, I would say, well into fall. So sometimes that can be a later crop sometimes. Once that is done, we're just going to mow them down. And that's it, because what's going to happen in the spring, we're going to get a new primocane crop growing out of the ground. So we're managing these just for the fall crop only. We are only ever cropping these off of that first year's growth. This is not the only way we can do it. We can also grow these so we have both that fall as well as the following summer crop. So the same thing. In the summer, we're going to tip them at about 3 feet. We're going to look at thinning the row where necessary. They're going to grow. We're going to harvest them in the fall. What we're going to do in the dormant season, so this time of year, that following spring, we're going to remove the dead tips, because where these have fruited are actually going to die back. So those tips of the cane, where the flowers were, where the fruit were, they naturally die back. And we're just going to cut those out so they're out of the bramble yard. We're going to thin out, again, any weak canes that are there to about 3 to 4 feet, 3 to 4 canes per foot of row. That summer, we're going to have a normal floricane crop on what was left behind. So this way we actually get 2 crops. And again, we'll have those new primocanes growing at the same time that are going to be fruiting that fall. So during the summer, we actually have floricanes present that we're going to harvest from, as well as primocanes that we will harvest from at the end of summer. So we get 2 crops off of the same plant. So that's really the 2 methods we have on primocane. Some people like the simplicity of just doing a single crop, but we absolutely can get a good harvest off that second fruiting on the mature floricane. So there's not a reason that you have to only manage them for 1 crop. A lot of farmers market growers like primocane fruiting varieties because it allows you to have cash flow at a different time of year, have berries available fresh at a different time of year, which is attractive to consumers. And certainly homeowners enjoy that as well. So again, there's not a lot of difference in the different varieties. We basically have the same basic tasks that we're doing, tipping, thinning. But at the end of the day, there are differences between those that fruit on the floricane, the year 2 growth, versus those that can fruit on the primocane or year 1 growth. As always, if you have questions on that, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to assist you with that. So while I lumped blueberries in with our other berries tonight, they're actually fairly different because they are a woody plant. They're a true perennial, not a biennial. And so we manage them a little bit differently. In some ways, we manage them more like a tree in some manner, but still rather different. And we'll talk about that some. But we almost sort of ignore everything we just talked about, and we'll be looking at blueberries kind of separately. So let's say we have a new planting. If we have bare root plants, when we plant those, we're going to head back the younger canes to 8 to 12 inches tall. We're going to prune off any older canes. Older canes are typically going to be more woody looking. They're typically going to be more gray, and any lower shoots as well. Things that are growing horizontally, crossing over each other, are not well suited for future production. So we're going to prune those out. So we're going to end up with a very minimalist plant at planting. Container grown plants, which are available to us, we're basically going to do the same thing with one additional step, because with container plants, we're concerned if they're root bound. So if you take the pot off of your plant and you have roots that have curled around the inside of that pot, you need to do something about it. Depending on the severity, you may be able just to tease the roots out, straighten them out. If you can't, you need to take a knife and cut that root ball, do vertical slits, because we don't want those roots to continue growing in circles. You can, if you do have to end up cutting the root ball, you can reduce that amount of top on the plant. Truthfully, if you just go ahead and plant it without pruning the top, you might get some dieback in the top. That's just the plant naturally balancing itself. So I kind of lean more towards, if I have to root prune, I'm just going to let the plant make that choice on what it leaves and what it takes. But certainly don't be surprised if you do root prune that you see some dieback, because again, you've reduced the size of that root system, and that's going to come at a cost to some of the above ground vegetative growth. But it's still something that needs to happen. If you don't do that, you're going to have a worse outcome. So do think about looking at those plants if they're root bound, and cutting those root balls as necessary. We don't want to have fruit production in year 1 or 2. And it's possible that your plant will try to do it. And so this time of year especially, we're starting to more visually see differences between fruit buds and vegetative buds. The fruit buds or flowering buds are generally the last 2 to 3 inches that we see on branches. They are more plump, they're larger, they're more round than vegetative buds. So we'll have flowering buds at the tip, vegetative buds behind it, and you should see a clear difference in those, especially this time of year as we're getting warmer. They're starting to enlarge, get plumper. You should be able to visibly see a pretty big difference. So those first couple of years, we don't want to have flowering. So we can either go in by hand and just rub those off, we can cut them off, but we don't want flowering to happen, because early flowering will stunt your plant. We want all the growth and resources to go to establishing that plant, growing the structure, growing the root system, and we don't want fruit in year 1 or 2. If you have a really great growing plant and year 2, you want to leave a few, so you have a few berries, that's fine. But just understand, the early berries come at the cost of that plant growing and establishing itself. So you get much better payoff by avoiding fruiting those first 2 years and waiting until year 3 that you actually get any production. So just to hammer home, if you think about, if you've seen your blueberries flower, where do they flower at? It's on the branch tips. It's on those distal or end portions of the branches. And so that's why we go in there. You will start seeing that difference if you start looking closely. So we've planted them year 1. We've taken care of doing that first establishment pruning. What happens? It grows all year, and then we get back to dormant season. So this time of year again. What we want to do is look at, one, removing fruit buds, because again, we don't want any fruit production happening in the second year. So we're going to remove any fruit buds as necessary. So that may mean removing some small side branches and things like that you see depicted there on the left. We're going to prune off low growing or weak growing shoots. So you can see as we start cleaning up that bottom, we're removing those, because again, horizontal growth is not great, because as they get fruits on it, it goes even lower. So things that are crossing over each other, we like to get rid of. The very vigorous shoots, so the most vigorous shoots that we have, we're going to head those back 4 to 6 inches below the top of the bush, because if we allow them to keep going up and up, they'll start shading out the bush and they'll just keep trying to get bigger and bigger. So we don't want to do that. This is akin to basically we're trying to remove a central leader out of the bush in a sense. We don't want those to keep getting taller and taller and larger. We'd like the bush overall to be similar in size and not have a couple that are just ginormously tall compared to the rest. So we do look at cutting those back so that they are below the top of the bush. And when we do that, that's a heading back cut. We're going to get lateral growth, which is good. And so there you can see the finished pruning when we're done. It's thinner, it's cleaner, but still, it's relatively similar to what we started with. We just have cleaned it up. What about the third year? So with a third dormant pruning, okay, again, it's grown, it's produced new shoots, it produced new side branches. What we largely do is reduce what's there, because hopefully we've started establishing a good basic framework. So again, if we start nowhere else, we look at removing those low growing branches, anything close to the ground, anything that's weak, very small in size. We don't want to leave spindly little branches there. They're not going to be good for us. We also want to look at, when we get to this point, looking at those parts that are extremely bushy. And I'll have some more pictures in a little bit that kind of explain this, but it is not a bad plan to be removing at least 20% of your canes, your main branches, every year. And the reason is even a 3-year-old cane is not as productive as a year 1 or 2. And once you get to like 6 years old, they're just not productive hardly at all. And also you get smaller berry size on year 3. So, 20% is probably conservative. We could probably even take out more. So, at 20% every 5 years, basically the oldest possible cane you would have in there is about 5 years old if you're removing only 20%. So we do want to thin it out, remove some of those oldest canes that are in there. Again, oldest canes are going to have a different color bark to them. They're going to be more woody, and you'll see here in a moment what I describe as being more bushy. What we have is a topping again of the youngest, most vigorous canes, because we don't want them to overgrow the rest of the plant. I will note that in this diagram, there is a mistake. The number 1s at the top of the bush should be number 3. So there was a numbering issue with this publication that I saw when I was going through this. So just be aware of that. Don't let that throw you. That's just the same sort of topping of visitor shoots that we saw on the last slide. It's just a failure to correctly number it. And again, we like those new young shoots coming on, but we do want to control their growth. And this goes back to what I just said. 3-year-old wood produces smaller berries. And we do that heading back to encourage laterals, because as we are removing those oldest canes, we want more growth to happen. So you can see we've got quite a bit of open areas. And what we would hope to see is some more branching occurring in there, some more lateral growth, and some new canes arising as well. So here I borrowed these pictures from Bill Klein. He's a blueberry specialist at North Carolina State. What we have is, and I believe this is rabbit eye, but it kind of holds true for all the blueberry varieties, types. You have that first year growth with very little branching. You have that second year growth that we'd want to come in there and top. And then we have the laterals that are very fruitful. But then even just a 3-year-old branch, you see how much bushier it gets. And what happens is you start getting so many berries that you get smaller and smaller berries. And so it's not that you won't get production. It's not that you can't get production. It's just that the berries are much smaller. And so generally speaking, larger fruit is better. It's easier to pick. It's just as good flavor, if not better, than smaller things. And so it comes down to, if you want to limit what you're getting, it's better to reduce the number of fruit you have and get larger fruit. It's easier to manage. So this kind of shows you, and what we'll do is the next few slides are going to walk through how a 1-year-old turns into that 3-year-old and why it happens. So this will just hopefully give you a little bit of understanding of why we want to encourage that new growth and remove that oldest growth. So here we have a new blueberry stem in July of August. It starts setting fruit buds. So that's what those little red buds there at the leaf axial are. In January, we're dormant. We've got our fruit buds there. And then in June, we get our fruit crop. And we've got the branches vegetatively growing behind it on that stem. So that's the first year. Year two, that same twig, we've seen where the tip has died back, where it fruited. So now the side branches are going to fruit at their tips. You can see we have more berries, still decent sized berries, smaller than we saw the first year, but still very acceptable in size. So if we skip to the third year, those tips die back. Those side branches start producing berries. And this is where we start getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It's because it's always the side branches that are then forming fruit buds that growing season and fruiting the next year. And because of that, you get this kind of reduction in size. There's more berries. If we were to count individual berries on a plant, we're going to have more on this third year growth, but they're going to be much smaller. So this is why we like to be removing these older, bushier growth. Because remember, this is what it looks like in real life. We get that first year growth, very little branching. Second year growth, we get some terminal growth, which is not bad at all. But then that third year, it starts to get a little bit out of hand. And the reality is, too, if we're looking at this from an efficiency standpoint, if you had just a couple of bushes, you could go out there in that year three branch, you could prune it, thin it to where you'd have larger berry size. But if you're looking at efficiency, and this does come from commercial production, the quickest, easiest, and simplest way is just to remove that whole branch.
All the way to the ground.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah. And so if you had a vigorous cane coming off of it, you could cut it back to that. So it wouldn't necessarily be removing the entire cane from the plant, but you'd be removing it back to where you had some vigorous growth, either a year two or year one. And now again, you can thin that. You could go in there and start thinning it out, reducing that bushiness, doing some, pruning in that fashion, but it's going to be slow and tedious and take a while. And so it depends how many bushes you have, how much time you want to spend on it. Commercially, they would remove it because it's quicker, it's easier, and they get good results that way. And in truth, commercial production is all about production. How many berries of acceptable size can we get? Homeowners, you have a little bit more allowance. If your berries are small, it's no big deal. You can still enjoy them. But picking small berries takes longer than picking big berries. So even little considerations like that come into play. What if we have, and I failed to add this slide in the printed out handouts. I realized after I was looking through things that I forgot to put this in, and this I think is an important one. What about neglected plants? So very often I will come across blueberry bushes that are who knows how old, but they've not been properly dealt with, in short. So where we start with this is kind of the same way when we looked at neglected fruit trees. Start with the stuff that should be easy. Remove dead, diseased, or insect-infested cane. So things that are clearly a problem, get those out of the way. What you'll find in these neglected plants is a lot of lower growing branches, probably a lot of things that are horizontal. Remove those. Those are older. They're not going to be productive. If they're crossing over each other, it's a problem. So go ahead and start removing things like that and reduce what's there. Then you're going to look at selectively removing older canes throughout to promote new cane growth and improve light penetration. So this isn't something where I would say in one season you're going to completely rejuvenate these plants, but it is something you could do over a couple of seasons. Now, when you have an extreme case, and there's also the caveats along with this is do we have good fertility there? Lots of times, if the plants have been neglected with pruning, they've not been fertilized or anything like that. They've not had pest control. During drought periods, they weren't necessarily watered. So there may be more issues than just what we're seeing on lack of pruning. So sometimes we have to evaluate, is it worth the effort? And so when we have very severe circumstances, we can do what you see on the left, which is where you just really, really, really cut it back. So for rabbit eye varieties, you head those canes back to 6 to 12 inches above ground. For high bush varieties, you're basically cutting it off at ground level, and you want a root sucker to grow rather than a bud to pop on the sucker you left on the stump. Truthfully, if they've been let go for years and you've got a lot of disease issues and there's not new growth and you don't know if there was pH adjustment done to the planting area and so on, you might be better off, and I think certainly you would get to good berry production faster to just replace those plants. And so just consider that. It's not a real quick, easy thing to do. Certainly, you could try, this severe pruning to rejuvenate them. If it doesn't work, if you're not seeing good growth that next year, you can make the decision, okay, let's replace it. But sometimes when things have gone so long, you're honestly not going to salvage it. And so that's why it's at least worth the consideration. Is it worth my time and effort to do this? So with that, I will mention resources. You'll be getting this in email from me, but they can be found at this link.